This is October 16th, 1984. This is Joe Todd, and this is an interview with Mr. Noah O'Hare in Laverne, Oklahoma. Mr. O'Hare, where were you born?
I was born in northwestern Ellis County, right square in the last quarter in the northwest.
When's your birthday?
August the 6th, 1901.
1901. Who was your father?
James O'Hare.
And your mother?
Mabel O'Hare.
What was her maiden name?
Sipe.
Sipe. S-I-P-E?
Yeah.
Where were they from?
Oh, they come from Kansas, Eureka, Kansas here, in a mover wagon.
In a mover wagon?
Yeah.
What's a mover wagon?
A mover wagon?
Yeah.
Well, it's just a common wagon with an overjet on it and a team. They had two rigs. One was a spring wagon. They called them spring wagons them days. And they had a team on each wagon, one on the wagon and one on the spring wagon. And I really don't know how many days it was on the trip. I never had thought about that, but I think it took about 3 or 4 weeks.
They ever talked about the trip?
They never said very much about the trip. They had to ford a river over east, I know, somewhere, and they thought they didn't know whether they could make it or not. And my daddy, he started ahead in the wagon, and he told my mother not to start until he got across. But it was quite a little ways, and the water was pretty high on the wagon and pretty swift, and the horses could barely travel in it. And she didn't wait till he got across. He got about halfway, and then she started in, and they made her across all right.
What river was that?
Well, sir, I don't know for sure. It's between here and there somewhere, but I don't remember ever seeing what river it was.
What kind of house, what year did your parents come to Oklahoma?
1901.
1901.
They landed down there on the first day of April, 1901, on April Fool's Day.
How come they came to Oklahoma?
They had to take up land. They filed on a claim there.
So they filed on a claim while they were still in Kansas?
No, they filed on a claim in Oklahoma. They didn't file up in Kansas.
Okay, but were they living in Kansas when they filed in Oklahoma?
They was living out there before they came down here. But they came down here and homesteaded on this quarter land.
What kind of house were you born in?
I was born in a tent.
In a tent?
They had a little old tent. It was and a mover wagon, and they parked there, you know, on this claim, and most of the people made a dugout. Most of the people. When he pulled in there, there wasn't a thing in sight, no place in the country, not a tree, but one little tent, about 1.5 miles away. He could see the top of it. That's the only thing. The only thing you could see. And he had 5 little boys, older than I. And they started, the oldest one was 10 years old, and they started on this, to break a little sod, and they started on this here sod house. And they got that sod house finished by cold weather, and we lived in that tent all summer in the mover wagon, very small tent. And I was born in that tent on the 6th day of August. You know, that's a pretty hot place.
How did your parents find their homestead? How'd they know where to go to get on the land?
Well, I suppose that they had somebody that kind of guided them to it, but you had to come out here, and all this land would already been surveyed and marked off, and they could read the numbers, you know. They could read the numbers on these sections, and that's all they had to go by.
How'd they mark the corner sections?
They had rocks buried on the corner section. Then they had a tin thing set in the ground there, I remember, and they had numbers on there, and that's all they had to go by. And he made a little bit of a mistake. He thought he was getting the southwest quarter of the section, and he was right square in the corner of the northwest section, you see. And he thought he was getting this quarter over here as a little leveler land, a little better land than this. And he found out he was parked on the northwest quarter. And he didn't get the quarter he thought he was getting. But he got the numbers off of it, and he sent them to his dad in Kansas. And he got on the train and come down to Woodward, and that's where he had to go to file. And he filed on it. So his dad, he didn't come in a mover wagon. He loaded what stuff he had in a car, and at that time they had a railroad come through Shattuck, and he brought his horses and a couple of cows and what farming machinery he had, and he didn't come until early in 1902, but he'd already filed when my dad sent him these numbers, you know, and then he just unloaded his stuff down there and hitched his horses on his wagon and trailed his cows and his machinery and labeled everything and started to this location. And he found it. I don't know how.
How long did it take?
Well, there wasn't no roads. There wasn't no roads. You just went across the country. There were no roads or section lines of any kind.
Country pretty flat out there?
No, it's kind of a rolling country. About like this. It's not quite as flat as this. It's kind of rolling.
Good land out there?
Well, it's medium. Medium, fairly good land. When it was new, it was pretty fair land.
How long did it take for you to bust out the saw to get a crop in?
Well, that went pretty slow. The sod plow was only cuts about 12 inches, and it goes pretty slow, and it's just a walking plow, and what you could plow with a team in a day, you know. And about 2 acres is about all you could get over.
Did you have horses or mules to plow with?
They had horses. They had 4 head of horses.
Do you remember living in the sod house?
Oh, yeah.
What was the inside of furnished?
How was it furnished?
Yeah.
Well, when we first moved into this sod house, it was on a dirt floor. It didn't have no floor in it. And he got a hold of a little frame house somewhere that some cowboys had, and I don't know how he got it, but it's 12-foot square, and he moved it right up to the end of this sod house, and they had the kitchen in the frame house, and we slept in the sod house. Sod house is pretty warm, and they just had one bed in there. Of course, there's a big bunch of us kids, and they made ticks out of grass, you know, and they put them right down on the floor, and that's where we slept. And we lived in that until about 1909. And we lived in that little old frame on the end of that sod house. And then on about 1909, he built a big 2-story house. It's 28 feet square and Had 8 rooms.
What other furnishings did you have in the sod house besides the bed?
We didn't have any. There was no furnishing in there, only the beds.
What about the inside of the walls?
Well, they were just plastered. Plastered with some kind of cement. I don't know. I don't think it was even plastered on the start. They just dirt walls.
I've heard of people taking gyprock and burning it, making a plaster out of that.
Yeah, they had some kind of a plaster they used on some of them, and some of them used regular cement, and that stayed on better.
What about the roof?
Well, the roof was made out of footboards, and they was made in an oval shape. It's like this, you know, there wasn't no peak. And then they just cut this sod. They cut this sod about 4 inches or 5 inches thick. They had what they call a sod cutter, you know, and about 18 inches long. And they just took that out and stacked it up like brick. And they put the roof on this house. They just put it on out of 4-foot boards. And then they cut this sod and they laid it right on top of them roof. They just made a sod roof on it. And that's the kind of a house they had.
So was it a part dugout also, or just a sod house?
No,
on top
it
of
was
the
on
ground?
top of the ground. There was no dugout this one. Most people made a dugout first, when they first established a home. They made the dugout, and they had to have some shelter. And they lived in that dugout until they got a sod house built. Nobody had any money. They just barely had enough money to get here and get located.
Where'd you get the boards for the roof?
Well, they hauled them from Shattuck. There was a town down there, Shattuck, Oklahoma, and they hauled them from Shattuck. They had to go as 29 miles. It took 2 days to go down there and back. And that's where they hauled all their first crops, to Shattuck, and they hauled down there till 1913. And the railroad come in Laverne then, in 1913, and they established a little old town here, you know, and the railroad come through here, and then they could make the trips in 1 day, you know, come up here and back home. That made it a lot better.
What were the main crops that you raised?
Well, it's broom corn and calf corn and Indian corn. We raised some Indian corn, and we raised some pretty good Indian corn in them early days. The land was new, and they raised some pretty good corn. And they had to shell it with hand shellers. And then they got a little seed wheat and planted some wheat. And I don't know how they got this thrash machine, but they didn't get the thrash machine in there in time to thrash this wheat. They bound this wheat with a binder. I don't know. And they couldn't, come time to sow wheat, and they didn't have the wheat thrashed, they didn't have any seed. And they cleaned off a patch on the ground, and they cut the bands on these bundles, and they rode their horses around over it. And that's the way they got their seed. Trumped it out. Got it out of there and winded it out and sowed it.
Did you broadcast or have a wheat drill?
They broadcast it.
Broadcast?
They broadcast it.
How many acres did you broadcast?
Oh, it was just a small amount, and I don't know how much, but it was a real small amount. They didn't start very big, I'll tell you.
You get a good crop?
They raised pretty good crop. They raised pretty good crop, and they had to haul it to Shattuck. But it was a small amount, but the big crop was broom corn, the money crop. They had to haul it to Shattuck.
Tell me about pulling broom corn. How do you do that?
Well, the broomcorn grows on a stalk with a boot on one side and the head on this side, and you grab the boot with one hand and the head the other, and you just give her a jerk, you know, one head right after another. You got your handful, and then you pile it between the stalks, you know, hung it there till it dried, you know, and you get another handful. And I grew up in a broomcorn field, and we raised broomcorn there for about 20 years. And a good hand could pull about 400 pounds of broomcorn a day. And you'd rick it up, and then you'd have to seed it and bale it. And they hauled it to Shattuck. Sold it on the streets down there.
What kind of baler did you have for broomcorn?
Well, I had a broomcorn baler, and it made a bale weigh about 300 pounds. And and you could fit that in a wagon box. It just fit in the wagon box. And you could put about 6 bales in a wagon box. And they'd put a bale or 2 on top of them to stand them on ends. They'd lap together, they'd lap the heads together, you know, and the butts on each end, and that'd make a pretty nice bale. And then it had a squeezer in there that when they got the baler full, they shut the lid, and then they had a sweep on there that raised the bottom, you know, up and tightened the bale, you know, and they'd pull it around with a horse, put the wires on it. I'd done lots of it.
Where was the broom factory?
Well, they didn't have any broom factory here. There was a few people that made brooms, all right. But they hauled this broomcorn to Shattuck, and the Engel brothers down there bought the broomcorn. At that time, Shattuck was figured the biggest broomcorn market in the world. They shipped it all over the world.
When did you first get your riding plow?
Oh, they didn't get any riding plows till it was, they used walking plows, you know. They used them sod plows, and then they had to plow it up, and then they had to use what they call a disc. And they had to get a disc up that sod, you know. And that's the way they farmed the ground. They got discs, and then they got a lister. And they had walking listers. And I'd say about 1909 or 10, we got some good riding lister, and had some good mules, and you could list in about 8 acres a day. Plain it.
Did you use the same team of horses on all the equipment?
Yeah. Oh yeah, you use the horses for everything you done. Everything you done. You'd have to go in the wagon everywhere as you went. And we didn't have any cows for a couple of years. Well, my granddad, when he come, he brung 2 cows, and then they had 2 cows. They had milk. They didn't have any milk until then. There was no place to buy any milk or any bread. But Henry Spear, he was the father of Spearmore, and he'd filed on a claim there in about 1.5 miles and just over in Harper County. And he had a little store there when my dad came here, and it had about a wagon load of groceries in it, my dad said. And they could get beans there, and they could get this big old fat side meat, and that's about all they could get there, and a few little canned stuff, and potatoes, sometimes potatoes. For a few years, you know, but things went along pretty good, and it got better pretty fast. But I don't know how it did.
Besides farming, what kind of chores you do in the farm?
Well, the only thing you did on the farm was take care of the cows if you had any, and take care of the hogs after you got some hogs. And they didn't have any of that stuff when they come here. I don't know. It was hard to come by to get started. And chickens, after you got a little hen house, they built a little old sod hen house, you know, and they get a few chickens. And that's all they'd have to do about the chores is to gather cow chips. They burn cow chips, and that's what they use for fuel. Gather cow chips, and if they had a cow, milk the cow and feed the horses. Take care of the horses. They didn't have any fence, and they had to stake these horses out. There was lots of good grass, and of course that's all they had to work these horses on was grass on the start. They had no feed of any kind. They'd work them off the grass, you know. Do what work they could do with them.
When did you start to school?
I started to school when the state became a school. I started school in 1907. They built the state. They didn't have any schools until then. They just had some little private schools around where the farmers had somebody to teach their kids, you know. They just had a few private schools around. They had one about a mile of our place, or half a mile was. They built a little old shack, you know. And the older boys went there, but I wasn't old enough to go. And when Oklahoma became a state, that was in 1907, and I was 6 years old. And they built this little old sod schoolhouse and marked off a school district, and the state didn't have any money either. And we went to school on a dirt floor.
How many students?
And there's quite a bunch of kids. Every quarter section had kids. They could just file on 160 acres. And nearly everybody had kids. That's one crop that never failed. And they had, in this district where I went to school, they had about 30 to 35 kids there. And we went to school in that for about 3 or 4 years, and then the state built a frame building in.
Who was your teacher in that sod school?
Oh, we had one teacher, about the first one I remember. Her name was Virginia Bowling, and she come from Kansas City down here, and she was only 16 years old, and she taught a school there. And then we had another teacher or two taught there. But this young girl, about 16, she come down there and taught school there and stayed there for, I think it was 8 months we had school on the start. And I had a bunch of them kids in that little old sod building, and I remember one time it come up a wind and raised the roof on that old sod building, you know, on one side. The board just stick over, you know, and there's sod on top of it. Raised the roof on that building, boy, she turned south and sent us home. That's going to blow the roof off of it. Next morning I went back to school, and the farmers had come in and staked the roof down with barbed wire and stakes, you know, on the roof on it.
Do you remember Statehood Day?
Well, I remember going to school, but I don't remember it being a statehood day, no.
It was November 16th.
Well, I didn't know what day it was.
How many years did you attend school?
I went to school till I was about 16 years old, I think.
Okay. How many years did you attend school?
I must have attended about I must have went there about 9 years, I expect. And we had a lot, we had work to do in the fall. We had calf corn together, and we had broom corn to take care of. And when there was work to do, we didn't go to school. When we got the work all done, we'd go to school. And that way you got along pretty slow in school. You didn't make a grade every year like you do now. And we didn't get very much of an education. We finally got out of the 8th grade, and when we got out of the 8th grade, that was it. I didn't go to school anymore.
What kind of games or recreation did you have as kids?
At school?
At school or on the homestead?
Oh, we had baseball. Baseball was about the only kind of games we had. We played baseball. I don't know, we'd make the balls. We'd ravel out old socks and stuff like that, you know, and you could ravel and get them started to ravel them out, and then we'd make the balls. And we'd sew them pretty good on the outside, checkerboard them, and they worked pretty good. And we didn't have any mitts. Them balls wasn't as hard, you know, as old baseballs.
What did you put on the outside of the baseball?
Didn't put anything. We just sewed what we called a checkerboard stitching all over that ball, you know, and it hold it pretty good. And then when the old ball got ragged, we'd make another one. And that's about all the games we had.
What about holidays like your early Christmases?
Well, they wasn't much any different than any other day. They just about the same old thing. Kids would get a little candy. They'd generally get a little candy, and that's about all. There was no toys. About the only thing a kid would get on Christmas Day would be a little sack of candy.
What about a Christmas tree?
No Christmas trees. Well, they didn't have any Christmas trees in the early day.
When did you get your first Christmas tree?
Oh, I don't think we ever had a Christmas tree in our house. Till I was growing. I don't think we ever had a Christmas tree till I was growing.
What about Thanksgiving?
It wasn't much different than anything else. We paid no attention to it in the early day.
What was the big holiday that you celebrated?
4th of July.
Tell me about that.
The only time that we done any celebration that I know of was on the 4th of July, and I had a little old store up there in town, Spearmore, and they'd flock in there and celebrate a little, and have ice cream and little stuff like that, but didn't amount to much.
Have any kind of parade or fireworks?
They wouldn't, in the early day, they didn't have any fireworks that I know of until I'd been there growing.
You say Mr. Spear started the town of Spearmore?
Yeah, B.H. Spear. He started the town there, and they had, they finally got a bank there.
Are you getting cold in here?
No.
Having a lot of fun? We are. I got cold.
They had a bank there, and they had a drugstore. They had a couple of grocery stores. There's a man come in there by the name of Harding, and he put in a store. And finally got a doctor there.
What was his name?
Watts, Dr. Watts.
How big was the town of Spearmore?
Oh, awful small. They had about 2 stores there. They finally had a hardware store there, and they had a drugstore. They had a bank, and they had a lumber yard there at one time. And it was on about, I'd say, 8 or 10 residents in Spearmore. Maybe 12.
How come Mr. Spear founded the town?
Well, he staked the claim just like everybody else did. And he dug a well down there on the corner of his place in the canyon, and they ribbed it with rock, and it was 20 feet deep, 22 feet deep, and that's where we hauled water from about 2 years. Had a wooden pump on it, and we hauled water from that well on a sled all the time. They used sleds. You could go on the grass, you know, on a sled, put a horse on a sled and go right along on the grass, you know, and haul a barrel of water. Wasn't any roads.
Did a sled work better than a wagon?
It did for water when you put water in there, you know, and or you could haul it in a wagon. Yeah, you could put a barrel in a wagon and go get you. But the kids, older kids, you know, they'd put had a burro. My folks, I don't know where they got that old burro, but they'd gather cow chips on that sled and come in with that burro, and they'd ride the burro, and they had a harness for him. They never used no bridle on him. They just used a stick. Hit him on the side of the head and one turn, you know. They had him broke that way. He'd just go along real slow. You know, he'd pull that sled and he'd go a mile and a half after water and put a barrel on there and put about half full of water, and that's the way they haul the water.
You have a cistern there at the homestead?
No sister.
You just...
There wasn't no way to drain any water off of a sod house. It didn't work.
So you just use the water out of the barrel?
Use water out of the barrel until we got a well. We lived there, 3 or 4 years before we got a well.
How deep was the well?
That well was 150 feet deep there.
Dug well?
They drill them with this was a 2-inch tubular well. They drilled with a drilling rig.
What kind of bits they have in those drilling rigs to drill water wells?
Well, they just had a bit made out of the end of a pipe, you know, and they made this so that it'd blacksmith make it and sharpen it, you know, so it'd cut. And they had holes in it down there so it'd force the dirt out of it. And that had a pump on this. It pumped the water down through that pipe, you know, and that's a 2-inch pipe. That bit fit right on the end there. It just made out of a pipe, you know. And they had this drilling rig that they run by power from horses that went around like this, you know, around a thing that run the pump. They didn't have a motor on it. And that's the way they drilled them.
How long did it take to drill that well?
Gosh darn, it'd take sometimes 3 or 4 weeks to drill a well, and sometimes a month, depending on what you had to drill through. If you had to drill through some rock, it was pretty slow.
What kind of casing did you use in the well?
These wells are just made out of 2-inch steel casing.
How deep was the water table?
Well, this well, when I drilled a new well there after I bought the farm. Folks, the old well rusted out. I drilled a new well, and I put in a 4-inch steel casing. And when we got that drilled, it took about 2 or 3 days to drill it. They had better drilling rig then, you know. And next morning, I put a string down there, a wire. I used a wire and a weight on it, and I measured the water in it, and it had 39 feet in it. So the water raised 39 feet in that well.
Same depth?
Same Same depth, yeah.
150 feet.
And I pulled the 2-inch casing out of the well, and I didn't pull the casing. We tried to pull it, but we couldn't pull it. But we took the jet rods, what they call the jet rods, that works in the cylinder. We used the same jet rods, and we put this cylinder down in this well. On the end, we put what we call an open bottom well. It wasn't like the other. This hung from the top. And we used the same jet rods, the same length, when we put it in that well. Put it in a 2-inch pipe with a cylinder on the end of it. And an inch and 7/8 cylinder, and it pumped good. We had good water.
Good and soft?
Well, it wasn't so soft. No, the water wasn't real soft, but it was good water.
Wasn't jippy?
No, no jippy water there. No, it's real good water. And still there. That well's still working. One I drilled out there. I don't know what year that was, but it's been 25 or 30 years ago. I've got the drilling papers in there and everything yet. I know what date it was if I'd look at it, if I could find it.
Did you take over the homestead after your father?
Yeah, I bought it.
And what year did you buy it?
I'll be clear, I don't remember what year that was. Well, let's see. I had a car. I can remember what model that car was. I didn't know about when it was, but it's somewhere in the 30s. Somewhere in the 30s, I think.
Yeah. Let me back up for a minute. What did your father have to do to prove up on the claim?
He had to live there 5 years and establish a residence. That's all he had to do. You had to stay there 5 years, but you didn't have to stay there all the time. But you had to establish a residence for 5 years, and then they'd give you a patent to it.
What was the filing fee?
Filing fee.
How much did it cost to file on the land?
It's just a very few dollars, and I don't know what it was. I don't know how much it was. I don't suppose it was over $2 to file. I don't suppose.
Tell me about the Depression, 1930s.
Depression. Well, the worst part of the Depression was the dirt storms.
Tell me about them. How bad were they?
Well, we didn't raise anything for about 7 years. The dirty 30s, they called them. And the ground got to blowing so bad that it covered up fences, you know, and blowed out everything you tried to plant. And we farmed every year, but we didn't raise nothing. It was just dry. Speak of, and the grass even dried out to where you didn't have any grass, just have weeds and roots and thistles for the cows to eat. And we'd raise a little feed, but we didn't raise any wheat to speak of. Now we'd have maybe just a little bit of wheat, but wouldn't make over 2 or 3 bushel an acre. I farmed right through it.
What does the dust storm look like when it's coming, headed towards you?
Well, it's just a black dust storm. Sometimes it gets so black that we had one black storm there, and we got a picture of it yet. It come one evening about 5 o'clock, 6 o'clock. It was so dark, you couldn't sit in the house and tell where the window was at. We had to light the lights. It was just dark as a dungeon. You couldn't look out and tell where the windows was in the house.
Is that what they call Black Sunday?
Yeah, that's what they call call that Black Sunday.
How did you breathe in that dust storm?
Well, you breathed a lot of dust, I'll tell you that. That dirt had come from one side of the house. They didn't have very good houses them days. And they was all right on it. They wasn't built very tight and they're warm. And it'd blow in the dirt. You couldn't keep it blowing in the windows. And it'd come from the north one day and it'd blow in the north side of the house. It gets so bad in dusty in there. You'd move out on the other side of the house. Next day it'd come the other direction, fill the other side of the house. Maybe next day be nice and quiet. You take the furniture all out of the house, clean the house all out, get ready for another. And that's the way it went, boy. Just time after time.
Would you do anything to try to keep the dust out of the house?
Yeah, they'd hang quilts over the doors and one thing and another, windows, try to keep the dust out of the house, keep it off the table when you're trying to eat.
Yeah, how'd you keep from eating dust with the meal?
Well, you just had to manage for it. I said, hang them quilts over the doors and clean everything off and cook a little. It wasn't easy.
Have to eat real fast?
Yeah, you have to eat fast. I had a boy that had dust pneumonia and had to have a lung taken to the hospital and have a lung tapped. And a few people had what they call dust pneumonia. They'd wear, when I was out working at it, they'd wear a handkerchief over their face, you know. So they wouldn't breathe that dust that. I've wore it many times.
How long would a dust storm last?
Well, it generally lasts about 2 days. And then it'd quit long enough to come from the other direction. You'd go to bed one night, you know, and maybe be coming out of one direction, you get out, and the wind would change, it'd come from the other direction.
With the storms different colors, the dust?
No, it's about the same. Fields always got to blow on, you see what made the dust. It's bad. And they couldn't stop.
What started those dust storms?
That wind what started the dust storms.
Is this like the sod house that you had?
Yeah, yeah, that's the way they build them. Now you see that
Let's turn it around this way.
them footboards, they're just laid on top of that sod, and then this sod laid on top of the boards. See that sod? That's about 6 inches thick.
What about the windows? Where'd you get the window casings and the glass?
Well, they had to buy that. They had to go to Shaggy. That is hauled from Shattuck. Them windows, and they didn't have very many windows in them. And them sod houses was about 12 inches thick. They cut that sod about 12 inches thick and about 18 inches long. And it made a thick wall, and they just laid it up like brick. And it was buffalo grass. You had to have good solid buffalo grass or it wouldn't hang together. And there was lots of buffalo grass. And they just laid one right on another, right down on that grass, and never took the grass off of it.
How wide was the sod?
About 12 inches wide.
12 inches.
And about 18 inches long, like this, and they could handle them, you know. And this good, had a good root system on it, and they'd hold together. And they just start. Some of them put rock under there for foundation. And some of them was put right square on the ground. Some of them houses standing yet in the country. I know one down there in Hells County, and there's one out west here on the river, and it's stuccoed on the outside.
I bet they're warm in the wintertime.
Yeah, they was warm in the wintertime and cool in the summertime. They said, you know.
Well, how come people, if they were so warm, how come people build frame houses? Look
Well-
like that'd be a lot colder in the wintertime.
Well, they would. It would be colder, but them sod houses is a pretty good job to make when they was pretty small and they needed bigger houses. And them roofs wasn't too good. They might leak a little when it rained, you know. And they just temporary shelter. That's about all they was.
Okay, back to the dust storms. We were talking about what started the dust storms.
Well, they're just dry weather and wind. That's the only thing. They just had a dry season and bad winds just every day. That wind come up, you know.
So all the land had been plowed up then? and that's
Well,
what-
there was a lot of land plowed. Now, most of it is plowed out in our country, and it just got to blowing. And it just started in a patch in a field and blow this way one day, and the next day it blow back and blow the other way, and that just keep getting bigger, you know. And first thing it'd be all over the field. Then the whole fields would be blowing.
Would you do anything in the field to try to hold the topsoil?
Yeah, they tried to dig it up, some of them did, but they didn't do very much. They didn't do as much as they should have done. They just thought, well, it'll quit, but it didn't. They'd go out and farm it every year, go out and plow it up every year, and put in a crop, but she'd just come again, same old thing, you know.
How did you survive those years without making a crop each year?
Well, we had some milk cows, and people lived off the land then mostly. Cows and hogs and chickens. We didn't have everything like we have it now. We didn't go anyplace much. But we did have cars. We had cars then.
What would your average meal consist of in those years?
Oh, mostly potatoes and meat. We butchered our own meat and salted it down, you know. We'd have potatoes and meat and bread. And in the summertime we'd have some garden stuff. And maybe buy a little canned stuff out of
So
the
you
store.
were able to raise a garden then?
Well, not very much unless you watered it. You'd have to have water. You'd raise a little garden by watering it.
Did you raise your potatoes or buy them?
We raised potatoes nearly every year. A few potatoes. You planted potatoes early in the year, but some years there we didn't raise any potatoes. But everybody planted potatoes. I used to when I was growing my family outfit. I planted 100 pounds of potatoes every year. And we'd have potatoes all summer and part of the winter.
And did you water your garden?
We didn't water them potatoes. The other little garden stuff we watered. We never watered potatoes.
Well,
We
how did
didn't
they
have-
grow then if it was through the dust storms?
They didn't during them bad dust storm years. We didn't have very many potatoes. Didn't grow anything to speak of. We'd have some cows and we'd have milk and butter, you know, and we had to manage to get hay. We'd go a little feed for them cows and we'd raise a little bit of corn, calf corn, you know, and fatten our hogs on, but didn't have much to sell.
What time of year would you butcher your hogs and your beef?
We wouldn't butcher till cold weather. You couldn't keep the meat, you know. We didn't have any way to keep meat outside of curing it. You'd salt it down, you know. It'd have to be cold weather before it's cold, you know.
What are the major differences between butchering a hog and a beef?
Well, the only difference was you scalded the hog with hot water and scraped the hair off of him, and the beef you had to skin him. That's about all the difference was.
Would the neighbors all get together at butchering time?
Yeah, they did. We had a vat made, you know, that you could roll a hog in, you know, and when the butchering time come, one and set it right on the ground. It was made about this wide and about 6 foot long, made out of tin and steel, and they used to hang some there and we'd throw old posts and wood under there, you know, and heat the water and put them hogs in there and put a chain around, 2 chains around, you know, and a man on each side, and we'd roll them in there to scald them and then pull them out on a board. We'd platform we'd have fix and scrape. Now that's the way we done the major butcher. Now if you just, a lot of them, they just butchered one hog, they just set a barrel down and heat a lot of water and put in this barrel and just scald one end of him at a time. Poke him in that barrel, you know. Then long later on, after I got older, we quit that scalding hogs. We went to skinning them just like a beef. And they're not as easy to skin. The skin don't separate. And it takes quite a little while to learn how to skin a hog to do a good job. But I did learn how. I done lots of butchering. I learned how to skin a hog and make him just look slick.
How many head of cattle or hogs did you butcher at one time?
At home one time, we butchered 15 hogs. Weighed about a little better than 200 pounds when we was over at home, a big bunch of us. But ordinarily, in my time, after I got to raise the family, I butchered about 4 to 5 hogs. Good big hogs a year.
And tell me about curing your hams. How'd you cure those?
We'd salt them down, and they finally got a cure, you know, you could buy it. It was already mixed. Morton's smoked salt, they call it. Morton's smoked salt. And you could lay this meat on a board, on a table, you know, and put salt all over it. All this Morton salt. And this salt was smoked. It had smoke in it, and you'd have awful good meat. It'd be just like smoked meat. It made awful good meat. But in earlier days, they didn't use anything but plain salt. And they just rubbed it with that salt and covered it with that salt for about 3 or 4 weeks, and they'd take salt, you know, and then just hang it up, you know, it'd keep.
Do you smoke your hams?
They'd smoke it, yeah.
What would you smoke it with?
Well, we use mostly cobs. Now I got a cousin that wrote a piece in the paper there, and she said they smoked their meat them days with hickory wood. But she was wrong about that. There was never no hickory wood in this country. They could use wood if they had wood, but in early day there wasn't any trees in this country when they first come here. Like it is now, there just wasn't no trees. And they come later, them trees did, got started on the creeks. And there wasn't any creeks much. There wasn't any water much in the creeks. Very close drowned out in there. But they used cobs. They throw a bunch of cobs in a tub or something and set them afire, you know, and get them to go and then put a lid on it, and it's kind of smothered down the smoke. And that'd make pretty good smoked meat, just out of corn cobs. I smoked a lot of it that way.
How does the flavor differ from hickory smoked?
Well, not very much difference. Not very much difference, I don't think. Hickory gives it a little bit of a hickory taste and the smell. Now, I don't know how they made this Morton sugar cure. They call it a sugar cure. They put sugar in it. Morton sugar cure, they call it. They'd come in gallon cans, and it really was good stuff to cure meat with.
How would you how would you preserve your beef?
Well, we didn't have much way of preserving beef. The only way it done, we'd butcher beef in the wintertime, and then we'd have to eat it up, you know. you can hang beef, and we could then, as colder seemed like, you could hang beef up out on a tree or up high on something, you know, and wrap it with something, and you know, you wanted some of it, you just go out and let it down and cut you off what you wanted, and then put her back up there. In the wintertime, you couldn't butcher only in the wintertime. And when you butchered the beef, you'd divide it up around. You'd sell part of it or loan some of them a quarter, and you'd take a quarter, you know, and the family, you'd eat it up before it had time to spoil. That's the way we got our beef. And you'd peddle beef. I butchered and peddle beef right along. Just kind of chunk it out around over the country.
What was the price of beef back then?
What is what?
The price of beef at that time?
It's about 15 to 20 cents a pound. Mostly beef. I paid lots of beef, 15 cents a pound. Back there in them Dust Bowl days when hogs got so cheap, why, I butchered and peddled hogs over the country. And my gosh, you could buy a hog on foot for 3 cents a pound, and it got less than 3 cents a pound. And you could butcher a hog out, and I remember selling sausage for 7 cents a pound. And then meat about 10 to 15 cents a pound. Buy a 300-pound hog for $9. I went to buy a hog from my neighbor one time. He wasn't only about $2.75, and he said, I don't like selling hogs for less than 3 cents. I said, I wouldn't kick on 3 cents for a butcher hog. And we weighed the hog, and he weighed about 300 pounds, about $9 for a hog.
Do you remember World War I?
Yes, I remember it real well.
Tell me about it. What do you remember of it?
Yeah, it only lasted a year. And the boys all went to the army, a big part of them. And we stayed at home and farmed and raised cattle and fed hogs. And we had some awful bad flu.
How bad was the flu epidemic around Spearmore?
Oh my gosh, it was bad. We had, every week we'd have 2 or 3 funerals. People died with pneumonia. They had pneumonia. Didn't have any doctors that knew anything about flu. Ain't much of a way to doctor it anyhow.
What kind of medicines would they use?
About the only thing they ever used is soda water and aspirin for flu. When you got pneumonia, they had a green salve you could get and make pulses out of it and put it around you and bring you out of it sometime. It only took about 7 days for a man, 6, 7 days, and he took pneumonia, and if he didn't get better, he died. I had it in both lungs so bad I couldn't breathe any further down that when I was about 17 years old. And they made pulses out of corn flour. Just made a thick pulse, made them hot and warm, put it on my chest, and wrung me out of it. The doctor come out and gave you a few little old drops of medicine in a glass of water, didn't nothing. You either got well or you died.
When you were a small boy and you cut yourself, what kind of medicine would your mother use on it?
Turpentine. That's about the only medicine I had. Turpentine. Cool oil. They had a little medicine they called still got it. That's about the only medicine I had. Turpentine and grease. Make grease on it. They'd use that for a cold around your throat, and they'd rub it on you, you know. Put a cloth around your throat. Put you to bed.
What about World War II?
Well, World War II was a little different. It never quit. When it started, it never quit. It just went on and on and on. And when after it was over, they kept drafting me, and you remember that. And they went to the Army. I only had one boy in the Army.
Was there any organized efforts to support the war?
Oh,
like
yeah.
bond drives and...
They sold bonds. War bonds, you know. Government did. You're supposed to buy war bonds.
Did you buy any?
Yeah, I bought some. They drew about 3% interest.
How long did you keep them?
I kept some of them darn bonds for years. I got the E-bonds, and I kept some of them bonds until I retired 18 years ago. And I thought you didn't have to pay any taxes on them until you cashed them. Any interest on the tax, you know, you got it. You cashed them. And I had quite a batch of them bonds yet when I retired. And I thought when I retired I wouldn't have any income, and I wouldn't have to pay much taxes on them. I didn't need the money, and I just they got up to, you know, where they drew it 5 or 6%, you know, 5% I think it was. But it didn't work out that way. After I retired, I had bigger income than I ever had. I sold all my cattle, and I didn't sell my land. I had 800 acres of land, and machinery and everything. Wound up, and I had these wound up a lot of money and put it on interest. And I've had bigger income since I quit farming than I ever had.
So did you farm during World War II?
Yeah.
When did you quit farming? What year?
In 1966.
1966. What year did you move to Laverne?
I moved in this house in 1966. I bought this house, moved in here in 1966.
And how far is Laverne from Spearmore?
It's 13 miles. It's 13 miles to Spearmore. It's a mile and a half. We live in 14 and a half miles. We live a mile and a half away. It's 12 and a half miles, about 12 and a half miles from Laverne, I guess, from Spearmore.
Speaking of 1966, tell me about Jane Giroux. You know her?
Yeah.
What kind of person was she like?
Well, she's just like all the rest of the girls. She was a real nice girl, and she was good at what she done. And she lived right there in that house.
Cross Street?
Yeah. And she never lost a contest. That girl, whenever she went in, she win. She's just good at it.
What was your reaction when you heard that she'd won Miss America?
Well, we didn't have any idea she'd win, but she did. Now, we didn't act like them there ball players do when they win a game. Them devils went crazy up there. Did you see it?
Yeah, I saw that. Did the town have a big celebration when she came home?
Oh, they cleaned this town up. They cleaned this town up, painted everything. Yeah, they sure did. They celebrated.
What'd you do in the celebration?
We didn't have a celebration day, you know. But they put that big thing up across the street. You seen it when you come in, didn't you? Mm-hmm. And they painted the old depot down there. It used to be there and hadn't been painted for 40 years. And they cleaned the town up. And they had some kind of a parade
had lunch with her in Vietnam.
Oh, you did?
She was touring over there as Miss America.
Well,
That's the only time I ever met her.
well, I knew when she was a kid, her kids and my kids went to school together here. Her and my kids, I don't say her kid, but her and my kids went to school together.
Who founded the town of Laverne?
Who done what?
Who founded the town of Laverne?
I don't know. I don't know who founded the town.
Well, what else you want to talk about?
Well, right now, I believe I'll move around like that.
They got us out through the pasture.
Oh, yeah.
That was in 37, wasn't it? No, that was 38 when
We had some big
That's-
snowstorms out there. I lived on the highway out there, and we've had to keep people for a couple of nights, you know. You come to the east, and that's kind of aggressive coming to the east, and get over there where we live is wheat fields, and the snow blowed off, and it blocked the roads. And then they couldn't go any further. And they've stayed with us. I don't know. You all stayed there one night.
yeah, well, that's when we came back from
Yeah.
Edgar's that time, and
Couldn't get any further.
we got San Antonio, and they said we couldn't go any farther, and we stayed there a couple of days. They weren't used to ice or anything. There was so much ice down there. One day it was, I've forgotten what it was, the kids were all in their bare feet, and the next day, why, there was sleet and snow down South Texas, and they weren't used to it. But we got to San Antonio, and the cars were sliding off of the highway, so we stayed there. And then we got out of there and got up to Arnett, and they said, you can't possibly go any farther. But we saw a truck and got in behind it and got up to their place, and then we stayed there for 2 or 3 days before we could get on home.
When them
That
old roads
was-
got blocked, you had to wait. I seen it. What year was we had so bad here since I come to town? What year was that?
Gee, what, I was trying to think what year it was that we had that big snow on October the 8th. That wasn't the
This
one.
come in March, wasn't it?
Well, yes, we did have a big one then.
3 foot,
We sure did.
and it drifted awful bad here. And you couldn't get. We didn't get out of the house for over a week. We couldn't get out of this house for over a week, and
Was it?
the snow is drifted up. Why you could walk right off the drifts right on the roofs around here?
Well, I was gonna say, a lot of people, they could just, like you say, walk out across the top of their houses just from the snow.
And there's cars all over town that snowed clean under. There was one
I can't
right
think
west,
what
set
year
right
that
west here,
was.
and this next driveway is snowed
About
clean
the
under. You
big
couldn't see it.
snowstorm where, you know,
They
people
had
could
to
just
start digging that out, and
walk
after
up on
about a
their
week,
roofs
started
from
digging that car
snow.
out.
What year was that?
I can't think what year that was.
There was a big snowstorm in '71, I remember, because I was working at Beaver on the history bus. And it came in from the northeast, and then changed and came from the northwest.
That was, this
Yeah,
snow
from the
since I
southeast,
moved
I
in
mean.
here was the biggest snow I ever seen.
can't remember what.
But it was so deep you couldn't even go around it. Nobody had any horses to ride anymore. You couldn't hardly ride a horse. They've had cattle, hay from the airplanes around here.
Oh, yes,
Couldn't get
that's
to 'em.
been 2 or 3 different times, but then 38 didn't, wasn't that
I
when
don't know what year that
so many
was.
cattle smothered under the
Oh, yeah.
bridges and things?
They lost lots of cattle.
I heard there was a big blizzard in 1914. Do you
Well,
know that?
the year that the railroad come into town here, they had a big snow that winter, and that's 1912. The year that railroad come in here, 12 and 13. They had big snow. Yeah, they had a big snow back there. I remember that. It come about. Oh, it come at Thanksgiving time. It never went off till spring. That was further back though in 14. I was about 12 years old. It must have been about 1912. Yeah, or 11 or 12.
seemed to me I read where there was a big one in 12.
11 or 12, that's what it was.
I
They,
don't remember.
they didn't have any cars then, and they didn't have any graded roads too much, and they didn't have any way to grade it off. But that stayed on all winter. We used buggy and wagons, and they put runners on the buggy, and they kept them on there all winter.
Use them for sleds.
They used them to travel, you know, made a sled out of the buggy.
Mhm.
I think that was about 11 or 12, between 11 and 12.
That's the year that my father lost so many head of cattle.
He lost
remember
lots of
them
cattle.
telling
They
about
lost lots of cattle.
Yes.
I still have a scar from one year when we lost so many cattle.
Ordinarily, it snowed, melt
They'd
off,
show
but
them
it didn't
the
melt
butcher
off that
knife
way.
and stick in
It
their
come
pockets, and I was
along
swinging
about,
the rope, swung up against one of the men and just split my knee all from way down here to way up there. And they told me, oh, he'll always be lame. And then I told you about the horse throwing me.
Yes.
Just after it healed up, I rode the horse and threw me, and I split it this way. And they told me I would always be crippled. I pulled him both times.
That's good.
But I did. I swung up against one of my hired men. He had a sharpened butcher knife in his pocket, split my knee open.
Well, you know, when I was working on the Beaver County history books, I did my best to find who put the drift fence through on the state line between the Oklahoma Panhandle and Texas Panhandle. And I did a lot of research on that. Well, I found out just the other day who put that through. It was Pascal Hibbs' grandfather, great-grandfather, and old Mr. Sims. Do you remember hearing about the Sims Ranch?
yeah.
And it was Mr. Sims. And I told Pack, I said, oh, I wish I'd have known that. I did a lot of research on that, see who built that fence there. And he told about snowstorm, I believe it was in 1888 or 89. And the cattle drifted south. And ahead of the storm, you know. And the snow just piled up around them and over them, and they said you could walk on top of the cattle, on top of the snow, and they froze to death standing there.
And that was what year?
Too far back for me there.
Well, I remember the folks telling about, no, it was in 1901. That's when my father came out here in a wagon, and his father and his uncle, or his brother, who would be my uncle, came through in a covered wagon from Laclede, Missouri, and they started out in January, just right after Christmas, and they got here in April. And they had one wagon fixed up with one of those monkey stoves, you know, and that was my father's wagon. And the second wagon then was where they carried their provisions and the feed for the horses, and they had 6 head of horses, and they'd change horses, you know, on those wagons. And 2 of the men would walk. They'd take turns walking, and they'd pick up sticks and cow chips and things to burn, you know, and put them in this second wagon, and their bedding and their food was in Daddy's wagon. And when they got up about, I think it was about 15, 20 miles from Woodward, they had a terrible snowstorm. And they came on to this family that his horses just balked. They just couldn't go any further. And they, the man and a woman and a baby. And the woman had wrapped up in all the bedding she had to keep her and the baby from freezing to death. And the man was standing out trying to get his horses to go on, and they were just simply stuck there. And it was Bill Haight. Do you remember the Haights? You know, some of the Haights lived here in Laverne later. Is Bill Haight's father.
Well, Ori.
Ori Haight. Yes, I couldn't think of his name. And so Mrs. Haight and was Bill the oldest child? William?
I think he had a sister as old as him,
Oh, he did.
didn't he?
Well, anyway, the Mrs. Haight and the
Ed
child.
Haight, was that Bill's
Yes.
brother? I was gonna say Ed lived out there.
Yeah.
The other Haights lived right straight south of us. Barbara, the girl that was born, I remember Dr. Hill saved her life. She was born with her stomach on the outside instead of like
Oh,
we're
yes,
supposed
I
to be.
remember hearing that.
And he oiled and massaged that stomach and took her on into Shattuck and they saved her life. They said if he hadn't have done that, she had never lived.
Mhm. Well, that was the Haight family.
They
And-
lived right back where I lived.
Yes. Well, they filed on a place west and north of Catesby. You remember the tornado?
Where he,
Mhm.
they find that tornado, blew away and
Yes.
killed Ed's wife.
Yes.
That's the
Catherine.
old man Haight's place.
Catherine.
Yes. And then Dad, you see, went on further north and west. He wanted down close to water. He went down to where the a creek flowed, you know. And he filed in the old Wentworth pasture. Billy Carnegie owns that land now. But these, I think they camped there. I think the Lloyds and Haight family camped there for several days before they could go on, you know, till the snow kind of went off. And then they went into Woodward. And I don't know just what Mr. Haight did, but my father went to the land office and they had a map showing what quarter sections, you know, were filed on, were taken, you know. And he picked out 3 or 4 places. And I know my grandfather, Thomas Lloyd, he picked out a quarter, be close to Dad. And the 3 Lloyd men picked out quarters, you know, of land there close together. But they went out and looked at it first. And they took a chance of losing it if somebody else had come in and filed on it. And then they went back to Woodward and filed on those 3 quarters. And the Haight family and the Lloyd family continued then to be good friends from then on. But I don't know what would have happened to that family if my father and grandfather hadn't come on, you know, and caught up with them. It was a bad time.
It took about, in them days, it took about 4 days to go to Woodward and back.
Yes, took a long time. In the wagon and team. Have you ever, do you remember a woman that was run away from Fort Supply from the insane asylum there and was running out on the prairie there? I can't think of her name. She's buried over there in Fort Supply Cemetery.
Well,
Her father was a rancher, and something happened to her, and you know, in those days everybody was insane. Now they know that there is a sickness, a mental sickness that you have that can be cured, but in those days the only thing they knew to do with them was put them in the asylum. Well, this lady got loose from the asylum, and she was very religious. She was walking like Christ walked, you know, 40 days, 40 nights out on the prairie, and she came up, my dad and Grove Yates run onto her. She was in the field where they were working, and Grove was just a young kid, 16, 17 years old, and he said, "Oh, she's crazier than anything," and she heard him. And boy, here she comes. She was just going to tear him apart. And my daddy talked to her and said, "Oh no," says, "it isn't you that's crazy, it's him that's crazy." And
Well,
they
you want
managed.
to take this? How was you gonna get a copy? Huh?
think we have a good interview.
We had a good one. I enjoyed it.